I never thought a propane heater would land me in the middle of a war with my homeowners association. But here I am, sitting in my living room in Phoenix, Arizona, staring at my lawyer's business card like it's a winning lottery ticket. My name is Harrison Tucker, and I bought my house in the Sunridge Estates development 3 years ago. It's a nice place, nothing fancy, but it has a decent backyard where I like to spend my evenings after work. I'm an accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown, and coming home to relax on my patio with a cold beer has always been my way of unwinding. Arizona evenings can get chilly, especially in winter, so last November I bought myself a nice outdoor propane heater. One of those tall standing ones that looks like a mushroom. Cost me about $300 at Home Depot, and it was worth every penny. I set it up on my patio, made sure it was on a stable surface away from any overhanging structures, and followed all the manufacturer's safety guidelines. I even checked the HOA rules before purchasing it. The covenant said nothing about outdoor heaters. I specifically looked because I knew how strict the Sunridge Estates HOA could be. They had already sent me 2 notices in my first year living there. One for leaving my trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, and another for painting my front door a shade of blue they deemed inappropriate. I had to repaint it a boring beige that matched everyone else's. Everything was fine for about 2 months. I enjoyed my patio, stayed warm during the cooler evenings, and minded my own business. Then one Saturday morning in January, I found a letter in my mailbox. The return address showed it was from the Sunridge Estates HOA, and my stomach immediately sank. I opened it right there at the mailbox. The letter was signed by Deborah Whitmore, the HOA president, and it informed me that my outdoor propane heater was in violation of Section 7.3 of the Community Guidelines, which prohibited outdoor heating appliances that pose a fire hazard or aesthetic concern. I read that line 3 times. The guidelines I had reviewed online before buying the heater said nothing about this. I went inside, pulled up the HOA website, and searched through the entire document. Section 7.3 existed, but it only mentioned permanent outdoor fireplaces and fire pits, requiring approval before installation. There was no mention of portable propane heaters. The letter stated I had 15 days to remove the heater or face a fine of $200, with an additional $50 for each week the violation continued. I was furious. I had checked the rules specifically to avoid this kind of situation, and now they were threatening me with fines for something that wasn't even in the guidelines. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed a gym and a pool. I arrived 10 minutes early and took a seat in the back row of the small meeting room. About 20 other residents were there, most of them older retirees who seemed to live for this kind of thing. Deborah Whitmore sat at the front table with 4 other board members. She was exactly what you'd expect. A woman in her mid-50s with an aggressively styled blonde bob, wearing a pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She had that look in her eyes, the one that said she took pleasure in enforcing rules and finding violations. Next to her sat Patricia Manning, the vice president, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The other 3 board members were Howard Chen, the treasurer, Margaret Sullivan, the secretary, and Dennis Crawford, a member-at-large who spent most of the meeting staring at his phone. The meeting started with standard business, approving last month's minutes, reviewing the budget, discussing landscaping contracts. I sat through 45 minutes of tedious discussion before they opened the floor for homeowner comments. I raised my hand immediately. Deborah acknowledged me with a tight smile. "Yes, Mr. Tucker, is it?" "That's right," I said, standing up. "I received a notice about my outdoor propane heater being in violation of the HOA guidelines. I reviewed the covenants before purchasing the heater, and there's nothing in Section 7.3 about portable propane heaters. The section only addresses permanent fire features." Deborah's smile didn't waver. "The board recently amended that section to include all outdoor heating appliances. We sent out an email notification 3 weeks ago." "I never received any email," I said. "And even if you sent one, you can't retroactively fine people for equipment they purchased in good faith before a rule change." "The email was sent to all homeowners," she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone that made my blood pressure rise. "Perhaps you should check your spam folder. Regardless, the rule is now in effect and all residents must comply." "When was this amendment officially approved?" I asked. She glanced at Margaret Sullivan, who fumbled through some papers. "The board voted on it during our December meeting," Margaret said quietly. "Was that vote announced publicly? Was there a comment period?" I pressed. Deborah's expression hardened. "The board has the authority to make amendments as we see fit to ensure the safety and aesthetic standards of our community. Your heater is an eyesore and a potential fire hazard. You have 15 days to comply or you will be fined. Next question." I sat down, jaw clenched. I wasn't going to win this argument tonight, not with Deborah running the show like a dictator. After the meeting ended, I approached Patricia Manning in the parking lot. She seemed more reasonable than Deborah. "Mrs. Manning," I said, "can I ask you something about this heater situation?" She looked around nervously, as if Deborah might jump out from behind a car. "I'm sorry, Mr. Tucker. The board has made its decision. But do you personally think it's fair to fine someone for a rule that didn't exist when they bought the item?" I asked. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Between you and me, I voted against that amendment. So did Howard. But Deborah had the other 2 votes and she's very persistent. My advice, just remove the heater. It's not worth the fight." But it was worth the fight to me. This wasn't just about a heater anymore. This was about Deborah Whitmore and her power-hungry approach to running the HOA. I had heard stories from other neighbors about her excessive enforcement, her tendency to drive through the neighborhood looking for violations, her habit of showing up at people's homes unannounced to measure lawn height or inspect paint colors. I went home and did some research. Arizona law requires HOAs to follow specific procedures when amending covenants. Major amendments require a vote of the membership, not just the board. Minor amendments can be made by the board, but they must provide reasonable notice and typically can't be enforced retroactively, especially if they result in fines. I also discovered that the December board meeting minutes weren't posted on the HOA website, which was a violation of Arizona's open meeting requirements for HOAs. Armed with this information, I sent a formal letter to the board, citing the relevant Arizona statutes and requesting that they rescind the fine and provide proper documentation of the amendment process. I sent it certified mail to create a paper trail. 3 days later, I received a response. It wasn't from the board. It was another letter from Deborah personally, and it informed me that since I had not removed the heater within the 15-day period, I was now being fined $200. She included a payment slip and a warning that an additional $50 would be added each week. I was livid. I immediately called a lawyer, a friend of a friend named Marcus Wright, who specialized in HOA disputes. He agreed to review my situation for free since we had a mutual connection. After looking at all my documentation, he told me I had a solid case, but that fighting it would likely cost more in legal fees than just paying the fines and removing the heater. These HOA disputes can drag on for months, Marcus explained over the phone. Even if you win, which you probably would, you're looking at $3,000 to $5,000 in legal costs. Is this heater worth that much to you? I knew he was right from a practical standpoint, but something in me refused to back down. What if I just move the heater? I asked. The rule says outdoor heating appliances. What if I move it indoors? Marcus laughed. Well, technically that would comply with their rule, but Harrison, those propane heaters aren't designed for indoor use. That would be a fire code violation. I know, I said. But it would solve the HOA problem. Don't do anything stupid, Marcus warned. This isn't worth getting yourself hurt or burning down your house. I thanked him and hung up, but the idea was already forming in my mind. Not because I actually wanted to use the heater indoors, but because I wanted to make a point. If the HOA was going to be unreasonable, I would show them what unreasonable really looked like. That evening, I moved the propane heater from my patio into my living room. I didn't turn it on. I just positioned it right next to my front window where it would be clearly visible from the street. Then I took a photo and emailed it to the HOA board with the subject line, "Heater removed from outdoor space as requested." I knew this was petty. I knew it was probably not the smartest move. But I was tired of Deborah Whitmore's tyrannical approach to the HOA, and I wanted her to know she couldn't push me around. 2 days passed without a response. I started to think maybe they'd just let it go, that they'd achieved their goal of getting the heater off my patio and wouldn't push further. I should have known better. On Saturday morning, I was eating breakfast when my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Deborah Whitmore standing on my porch, clipboard in hand, wearing oversized sunglasses despite the early hour. "Mr. Tucker," she said, her voice dripping with false pleasantness. "I received your email. Very clever." "I complied with your requirement," I said. "The heater is no longer in an outdoor space. Moving a propane heater indoors is a fire code violation," she said. "Did you know that?" "I'm aware," I said. "But that's not an HOA issue. That's between me and the fire department." Her jaw tightened. "This is exactly the kind of attitude that undermines community standards, Mr. Tucker. Rules exist for everyone's benefit. Rules that are made up on the spot and enforced retroactively," I shot back. "Rules that aren't properly documented or voted on according to state law." "I could report this fire code violation," she threatened. "Go ahead," I said, knowing I was escalating things but unable to stop myself. "While you're at it, maybe the fire department can review whether your amendment process was legal in the first place." Her face flushed red. "You'll be hearing from the board," she snapped, then turned and walked back to her white Mercedes SUV parked in front of my house. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. I had just openly challenged the HOA president. This was either going to end very well or very badly. It ended up being the latter. 3 days later, I received another letter informing me that the HOA had indeed reported my fire code violation to the Phoenix Fire Department. They included a copy of the report they filed, which described my propane heater as an indoor heating appliance creating an imminent danger to surrounding properties. I wanted to move the heater back outside just to spite them, but that would put me right back where I started. Instead, I unplugged it and put it in my garage, taking another photo as evidence. I sent this photo to both the HOA and the fire department, explaining that the heater was no longer in use and was being stored safely. The fire department sent an inspector anyway. His name was Lieutenant Rodriguez, and he was surprisingly understanding when he arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. "Look, Mr. Tucker," he said after I explained the whole situation. I get it. HOAs can be difficult, but you can't have a propane heater indoors even if you're not using it. These things leak, and carbon monoxide buildup is no joke. It's in my garage now, I said. With the garage door open most of the day, he nodded. That's better, but honestly, just to avoid any more problems, I'd recommend either returning it or selling it. Is this really worth all this trouble? I almost said yes, but looking at Lieutenant Rodriguez's tired face, I realized I was wasting city resources over a personal vendetta with my HOA. You're right, I said. I'll get rid of it. He seemed relieved. Great. I'll file my report saying the violation has been corrected. Try to stay out of trouble, okay? After he left, I sat in my garage staring at the heater. It had become a symbol of something larger, my resistance against Deborah's authoritarian control. But Lieutenant Rodriguez was right. This was getting out of hand. I decided to take a different approach. Instead of fighting the HOA directly, I would go after their improper amendment process. I pulled up the Arizona revised statutes and found the sections dealing with HOA governance. I printed out the relevant pages and highlighted the parts about amendment procedures, meeting minutes, and member notification requirements. Then, I drafted a formal complaint to the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA compliance in the state. I detailed every violation I could document: the lack of proper notice for the amendment, the missing December meeting minutes, the retroactive enforcement of a new rule, and Deborah's harassment, including showing up at my home unannounced. I also reached out to other neighbors who I knew had issues with the HOA. My next-door neighbor, Bill Henderson, had been fighting with them for 6 months over a tree in his front yard they wanted removed. Across the street, Jennifer Walsh had received multiple citations for her children's toys being visible in her driveway. 2 houses down, retired couple Frank and Linda Morrison had been battling the HOA over their solar panels. I invited them all to my house one evening to discuss forming a coalition. Bill and Jennifer came, but the Morrisons declined, saying they were too exhausted from their own fight to take on anything more. I think we need to push for new board elections, Bill said as we sat around my kitchen table. Deborah's been president for 4 years now, and she's only gotten worse. Jennifer nodded, but she controls who gets elected. She and her friends vote as a bloc, and most homeowners don't even show up to the annual meeting. Then we need to change that, I said. We need to get people engaged, show them how Deborah is abusing her authority. Over the next 2 weeks, we worked on building support. We created a simple flyer outlining the issues with the current board's governance and hand-delivered it to every house in the neighborhood. We started a Facebook group for Sunridge Estates residents to discuss HOA concerns. We contacted other homeowners who had been cited or fined in the past year. The response was overwhelming. It turned out that Deborah had created enemies throughout the entire development. People started sharing their stories in the Facebook group. One resident had been fined for having the wrong color rocks in their landscaping. Another had been cited because their house number wasn't the approved font. Someone else had been threatened with legal action for parking their work truck in their own driveway. The Facebook group grew to over 100 members in just a few days, out of about 300 total homes in the development. People were angry and they were organizing, Deborah noticed. She sent out an official HOA email warning residents about spreading misinformation and creating division in the community. She claimed that all board actions had been proper and legal, and that a small group of malcontents was trying to undermine community standards. This email backfired spectacularly. Even residents who had been neutral before now started questioning why the HOA president was trying to silence criticism. The Facebook group exploded with comments. Someone dug up the community bylaws and posted them, highlighting sections that Deborah had violated. Another person found records showing that Deborah had spent HOA funds on personal expenses, like having the community landscaping crew do work on her own property. Things came to a head at the next board meeting in February. The small meeting room was packed with over 60 residents, far more than the usual attendance. People were standing in the hallway, and the board had to move the meeting to the larger community room near the pool. Deborah looked nervous as she called the meeting to order. Patricia Manning looked absolutely miserable. Howard Chen kept shifting in his seat uncomfortably. When they opened the floor for comments, hands shot up everywhere. Bill Henderson went first, detailing his tree situation and how the HOA had ignored his multiple requests for clarification on their demands. Jennifer Walsh talked about the excessive citations for minor issues. Frank Morrison, who had decided to attend after all, presented a timeline of the HOA's harassment over his solar panels. Then it was my turn. I stood up with my folder of documentation. I want to address the propane heater situation and the broader issue of how this board operates, I began. In December, the board amended Section 7.3 of the Community Guidelines without proper notice to homeowners. This amendment was used to fine me for equipment I purchased in good faith. When I questioned this process, I was harassed, threatened, and reported to the fire department in retaliation. Deborah tried to interrupt, but the crowd shouted her down. I continued. I've filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate about the board's violations of HOA governance requirements. I have documentation showing that meeting minutes haven't been properly posted, that amendments have been made without following proper procedures, and that the board has spent community funds without proper authorization. I pulled out a spreadsheet that Howard Chen, who had quietly become an ally, had provided me. This shows over $12,000 in questionable expenses over the past 2 years, including $3,000 paid to a landscaping company owned by Mrs. Whitmore's brother-in-law for work that appears to have been done on her personal property, not community property. The room erupted. People were shouting questions, demanding answers. Deborah's face had gone pale. She stood up, trying to restore order, but nobody was listening to her anymore. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced, but people kept shouting. Patricia Manning stood up and put her hand on Deborah's shoulder, saying something I couldn't hear. Deborah grabbed her papers and walked out, leaving the other board members to deal with the chaos. Margaret Sullivan, the secretary, looked like she was about to cry. "I didn't know about most of this," she said into the microphone, her voice shaking. "I just took notes at meetings and filed papers. I didn't know about the expenses." Howard Chen took the microphone. "I've been concerned about several of Deborah's decisions for a while now. I asked questions about the expenses Harrison mentioned, and I was told by Deborah that everything had been approved properly. If that's not true, then I've been misled along with everyone else." The meeting dissolved into smaller discussions, groups of neighbors talking among themselves, planning next steps. Bill, Jennifer, and I stayed late, talking with other concerned residents about how to proceed. "We need to call for a special meeting to remove Deborah from the board," Bill said. "The bylaws allow for that with a petition signed by 20% of homeowners." "We can get that easily," Jennifer said. "I'll start circulating a petition tomorrow." Over the next week, the petition gathered signatures rapidly. Within 5 days, we had 40% of homeowners signed on, well over the required threshold. We submitted it to the board, demanding a special meeting within 30 days to vote on removing Deborah Whitmore as president and board member. Deborah didn't go quietly. She hired a lawyer and sent out an email claiming that the petition was invalid and that I was leading a witch hunt motivated by my refusal to follow community rules. She accused me of manipulating other homeowners and creating false documentation. This was a mistake. Accusing me of forgery made people even angrier. Howard Chen publicly resigned from the board in protest and confirmed that all the financial documents I had presented were accurate. Patricia Manning followed suit 2 days later, saying she could no longer serve on a board with Deborah. With 3 board members now gone, the HOA was in chaos. According to the bylaws, at least 3 board members were needed for a quorum. Only Deborah, Margaret, and Dennis remained, and Margaret was barely participating anymore. The Arizona Department of Real Estate responded to my complaint by opening an investigation. They sent an official notice to the HOA requesting all financial records, meeting minutes, and documentation of the amendment processes for the past 3 years. This kicked off a whole new level of scrutiny. The special meeting was held on a Saturday afternoon in early March at a local community center, since the HOA clubhouse was too small for the expected attendance. Over 200 residents showed up, the largest gathering in Sunridge Estates history. Deborah arrived with her lawyer, a stern-looking man in his 60s named Richard Blackstone. He immediately tried to take control of the meeting, claiming that the petition was procedurally flawed and that the meeting was invalid. But we had done our homework. Bill had consulted with Marcus Wright, my lawyer friend, to ensure everything was done by the book. The petition was valid, the meeting notice had been properly posted, and we had the required attendance for a vote. After an hour of arguments, Richard Blackstone finally admitted that the meeting could proceed but reserved the right to challenge any decisions in court. Deborah sat with her arms crossed, looking furious. When the vote was called, it was overwhelming. Of the 212 residents present, 194 voted to remove Deborah from the board. Only 18 voted to keep her, likely her close friends and allies. Deborah stood up immediately. "This is ridiculous. You're all making a huge mistake. This community will fall apart without proper leadership." "We'll take that chance," Bill called out, and the room erupted in applause. Deborah grabbed her purse and stormed out, her lawyer trailing behind her, already on his phone. With Deborah gone, we held an emergency election for new board members. Patricia Manning agreed to return as president. Howard Chen came back as treasurer. Bill Henderson, Jennifer Walsh, and a retired lawyer named Thomas Peterson were elected to fill the remaining positions. The new board's first action was to rescind all fines issued in the past year, pending a review of each case. My $200 fine was canceled, along with dozens of others that had been questionably applied. They also voted to suspend enforcement of any rule amendments made during Deborah's tenure until they could be properly reviewed and, if appropriate, put to a community vote. But the story didn't end there. The Department of Real Estate investigation uncovered more serious issues. The $12,000 in questionable expenses I had identified was just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper, they found evidence of systematic misappropriation of HOA funds. Over 3 years, Deborah had funneled nearly $45,000 from the community reserves to various personal expenses and payments, to family members for services that were either never performed or wildly overcharged. This crossed the line from HOA mismanagement into criminal embezzlement. The Department of Real Estate referred the case to the Phoenix Police Department's White-Collar Crime Unit. Detective Sarah Martinez contacted me in April to ask about the timeline of events and the documents I had uncovered. I provided everything I had, walking her through how I had discovered the first irregularities and how the community had organized to investigate further. "Mr. Tucker, I have to say, you did very thorough work here," Detective Martinez said in my living room, reviewing my files. "Most HOA disputes don't result in criminal cases, but this is pretty clear-cut fraud." "I just wanted to keep my patio heater," I said, which made her laugh. "Well, your patio heater started something much bigger. Mrs. Whitmore is looking at multiple felony charges. We've also identified 2 other board members who may have been complicit, though it looks like they might cooperate in exchange for immunity." She was referring to Dennis Crawford and Margaret Sullivan, who had both been largely passive, but had signed off on various expense reports. Margaret had already come forward, claiming she had just signed whatever Deborah put in front of her. Dennis was still being questioned. The case moved surprisingly quickly. By June, Deborah Whitmore was formally charged with 6 counts of fraud and embezzlement. The charges included theft of HOA funds, filing false financial reports, and using her position for personal financial gain. Each count carried potential prison time. Her lawyer, Richard Blackstone, tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor's office was taking a hard line. HOA fraud cases were becoming more common in Arizona, and they wanted to make an example. The preliminary hearing was in July. I attended along with Bill, Jennifer, and about 30 other Sunridge Estates residents. We sat in the back of the courtroom and watched as the prosecutor laid out the evidence. They had bank records, emails, invoices for services never performed, and testimony from contractors who confirmed they had been asked to inflate bills and kick back portions to Deborah. Deborah sat at the defense table looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. The confident, authoritarian HOA president was gone, replaced by a middle-aged woman facing serious criminal charges. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The judge found sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, which was scheduled for September. Over the summer, more details emerged. Deborah had been using HOA funds to pay for her daughter's college tuition, to fund renovations on her house, even to cover her car payments. She had set up a complex scheme of fake vendors and inflated invoices, and she had been getting away with it because nobody had been paying close enough attention. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, and Deborah's defense that she had simply made accounting errors fell apart under cross-examination. On September 23rd, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 6 counts. Sentencing was scheduled for November. In the meantime, life at Sunridge Estates was slowly returning to normal, though it was a different kind of normal. The new board was operating with unprecedented transparency. They held monthly town halls, posted all financial records online, and actively encouraged homeowner participation in decisions. The propane heater rule was officially repealed after a community vote, with 78% voting to allow outdoor heaters as long as they met basic safety standards. I had long since sold my heater on Facebook Marketplace, but it was satisfying to know the rule was gone. The stolen money was harder to recover. The HOA filed civil suits against Deborah, her brother-in-law's landscaping company, and several other parties who had benefited from the scheme. Some money was recovered through asset seizures and settlements, but the community would likely never get back the full $45,000. On November 15th, I returned to the courthouse for Deborah's sentencing. The judge had clearly been unimpressed by her defense during the trial. He noted that Deborah had held a position of trust within the community and had systematically abused that trust for years. "Mrs. Whitmore, you were elected to serve your community," Judge Robert Caldwell said from the bench. "Instead, you treated your neighbor's money as a personal bank account. You bullied residents who questioned your authority, and you attempted to cover up your crimes when they were uncovered. This court has no sympathy for such conduct." He sentenced her to 4 years in state prison, with credit for time served, followed by 5 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of $45,000 plus interest, and to perform 500 hours of community service after her release. Deborah's lawyer immediately filed a notice of appeal, but legal experts I spoke with said her chances were slim. The evidence had been too strong and the judge had stayed within sentencing guidelines. As I left the courthouse that day, I ran into Patricia Manning in the parking lot. She had attended the sentencing as well. "Hard to believe it all started with a patio heater," she said. "Yeah," I agreed. "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to sit outside in the evening and stay warm." "You did the community a service, Harrison," she said. "If you hadn't pushed back, Deborah would probably still be stealing from us. Who knows how much more she would have taken." "I guess," I said. "But I still feel weird about it. I mean, she's going to prison." Patricia shook her head. "She made her choices. She could have stopped at any time. She could have resigned when people started asking questions. Instead, she doubled down and tried to destroy anyone who challenged her. That's on her, not you." I knew she was right, but it still felt strange to have been at the center of something that ended with someone going to prison. I had just wanted to keep my patio heater. Life settled down after that. The HOA continued to function much better under the new board. They were cautious about spending, transparent about decisions, and actually responsive when residents had concerns. It was what an HOA should have been all along. I bought a new patio heater in November, a year after the whole saga began. This one was electric rather than propane, which I figured was less likely to cause any issues even though the propane ban had been repealed. I set it up on my patio, right where the old one had been, and that evening I sat outside with a beer, enjoying the warmth. My neighbor Bill came over with his wife Susan to christen the new heater. Jennifer Walsh stopped by with her husband and kids. Even Howard Chen, who had moved out of his treasurer role after a year, came by for a drink. "To standing up for what's right," Bill toasted, raising his beer. "Even when it's about something as simple as a patio heater." We all drank to that. It felt good to have the whole mess behind us. The neighborhood had been through a lot, but we had come out stronger on the other side. I eventually learned what happened to Deborah through the neighborhood grapevine. She served 2.5 years of her 4-year sentence before being released on parole. Her husband had divorced her while she was inside, and she moved to New Mexico to live with her sister. She would be paying restitution for years, probably decades, and her name had become infamous in HOA circles throughout Arizona as a cautionary tale. The story got picked up by local news at various points, especially during the trial. I did a few interviews with reporters, always emphasizing that I hadn't set out to uncover fraud or take down the HOA president. I had just wanted to use my patio heater without being harassed, but once I started pulling threads, the whole thing had unraveled. That's the thing about corruption, even small-scale HOA corruption. It's usually not one big crime but a series of smaller ones, each building on the last, until someone finally says enough is enough and starts asking questions. The Department of Real Estate used the case to push for stronger oversight of HOA finances throughout Arizona. They implemented new requirements for annual financial audits and stricter rules about expense reporting. Several other HOAs in the Phoenix area were investigated in the wake of Deborah's case, and a few more board members ended up facing charges. As for me, I became something of a reluctant expert on HOA governance. Other homeowners who were having disputes with their HOAs started reaching out, asking for advice. I helped where I could, usually just pointing them toward the relevant laws and suggesting they document everything. Most HOA disputes don't involve embezzlement, just overzealous board members who don't understand the limits of their authority. I ran for the Sunridge Estates board myself the following year, figuring I owed it to the community after everything that had happened. I served a 2-year term as secretary, which was enough to confirm that HOA board work is mostly tedious and thankless. But it was also rewarding in its own way, knowing that we were running things properly and treating residents fairly. My biggest contribution was writing a new set of community guidelines that were clear, reasonable, and actually approved by a vote of the membership. We got rid of a lot of the petty rules that Deborah had loved to enforce. Nobody cared anymore if your house numbers were in the approved font, or if your trash cans were visible for an extra hour on collection day. We focused on actual issues that affected property values and quality of life, like maintaining common areas and ensuring people weren't running commercial operations out of their homes. The whole experience changed how I thought about community governance. I had always been someone who kept to himself, who didn't want to get involved in neighborhood politics. But I learned that staying uninvolved just lets bullies and petty tyrants take control. Someone has to pay attention, someone has to ask questions, and sometimes that someone ends up being you even when you didn't plan for it. 3 years after the initial propane heater incident, I was sitting on my patio on a cool December evening, heater running, beer in hand, when my phone rang. It was Marcus Wright, the lawyer who had given me advice at the beginning of all this. "Harrison, I have a client who's in a dispute with his HOA," Marcus said. "It's about a basketball hoop in his driveway. The situation is escalating and I thought maybe you could talk to him, share your experience." I laughed. "A basketball hoop this time? What is it with HOAs and reasonable things people want in their yards?" "I know, right? Anyway, are you willing to chat with him? I think hearing your story might help him understand what he's getting into." "Sure," I said. "Send me his number." I ended up talking to Marcus's client, a guy named David Chen who was unrelated to Howard, for over an hour. I walked him through everything that had happened with my situation, emphasizing the importance of documentation and knowing the law. I warned him that these fights could take over your life if you let them, and that sometimes it was better to just let things go. But I also told him that sometimes you couldn't let things go, that sometimes a stand had to be made, not just for yourself but for everyone else who would come after you. If his HOA was acting improperly, if they were violating state law or their own bylaws, then he had a responsibility to fight back. David ended up winning his dispute without it escalating like mine had. His HOA backed down once he cited the relevant statutes and threatened to file a complaint with the state, but he thanked me profusely for the advice and the encouragement. That became a pattern. Every few months, someone would reach out looking for advice about an HOA dispute. I helped where I could, always starting with the same message about documentation and knowing your rights. Some people asked why I stayed in Sunridge Estates after everything that happened. The honest answer is that it's my home. I like my house. I like most of my neighbors, and the community itself is actually pretty nice when it's not being run by a corrupt tyrant. Moving would have felt like letting Deborah win somehow, even though she was in prison. Plus, I had invested too much in making the HOA work properly to just walk away. The new board was good, but they needed engaged homeowners to keep them accountable. I attended most meetings, not to cause trouble but just to stay informed and to make sure we didn't slip back into bad habits. The civil lawsuits against Deborah and her co-conspirators dragged on for years. We eventually recovered about $32,000 of the $45,000 stolen, mostly through seized assets and garnished wages. The HOA put that money into a reserve fund with strict controls and oversight, determined never to repeat the mistakes that had allowed the theft in the first place. I kept my propane heater for several more years, eventually replacing it with a newer model when the heating element started to fail. Every time I turned it on, I thought about that first letter from Deborah, and how a simple citation had spiraled into a criminal investigation and prison sentence. It's funny how life works sometimes. You think you're just dealing with a minor annoyance, a petty rule enforced by a petty person. But then you pull on that thread and discover a whole tapestry of corruption and abuse. And suddenly, you're in the middle of something much bigger than you ever intended. Would I do it all again? Honestly, I'm not sure. It was exhausting and stressful, and there were times when I just wanted to pay the fine and move on. But I'm proud that I stood up for myself and my neighbors. I'm proud that we removed a corrupt board and implemented real reforms. And I'm proud that our community is stronger and better governed because of it. My patio heater still sits in the same spot where this all began, keeping me warm on cool Arizona evenings. But now when I sit outside, I'm not just relaxing after work. I'm also keeping an eye on my community, staying informed, staying engaged, making sure that the mistakes of the past don't get repeated, because that's what good neighbors do. They pay attention. They ask questions. They stand up when something isn't right, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. And sometimes, if you're lucky and persistent and maybe a little bit stubborn, you actually make a difference. The propane heater that started it all finally died last month after 6 years of faithful service. I replaced it with a new model, top of the line, with better heat distribution and safety features. When I set it up on my patio, I took a photo and posted it in the Sunridge Estates Facebook group with the caption, "Still heating my patio after all these years." The comments were full of people laughing and sharing memories of the whole saga. Someone posted an old news article about Deborah's conviction. Someone else joked that we should put up a plaque commemorating the spot where I staged my peaceful resistance. But my favorite comment came from Patricia Manning, still serving as HOA president after 4 years in the role. She wrote, "That heater changed this whole community. Who would have thought a $200 fine could lead to all this? Who would have thought indeed?" I certainly never imagined when I bought that first heater that it would lead to criminal investigations, trials, prison sentences, and comprehensive HOA reform. I just wanted to be warm while drinking my evening beer. But sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to the biggest changes. Sometimes standing up for yourself over something minor reveals much larger problems. And sometimes, a homeowner association just needs someone to say no, to push back, to demand accountability. I'm glad I was that person for Sunridge Estates. And I'm glad I kept my patio heater, moved it indoors in defiance, and refused to back down when threatened. Not because I'm particularly brave or righteous, but because someone had to do it, and that someone happened to be me. Now, years later, I sit on my patio with my new heater, surrounded by good neighbors in a well-run community, and I appreciate what we all accomplished together. It started with me and my heater, but it ended with an entire community standing up and demanding better. That's worth more than any patio heater. no matter how expensive or efficient. That's the real warmth I feel on these cool desert evenings, the warmth of knowing we made a difference.